Have you ever wondered what's the difference between skeptics and stoics? Well, we think that they're pretty different, but really they have a lot more in common than you would expect. In fact, if you go back to ancient times, the very first skeptics were actually stoics. In this video, we will explore the origins of skepticism, how it compares to stoicism, and how these two philosophies are both similar and different. So when did skepticism start? And here's where things get interesting, because the very first skeptics were not the ancient Greek skeptics that we'll talk about in a moment. They were actually the Stoics, specifically the early Stoics who lived in the Hellenistic period, like Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, or Cleanthes, or Zeno of Ptolemy. But what exactly did they do and how were they skeptics? Well, let me explain. When these early Stoics started their philosophical investigation, they realized that there was no simple answer to questions like, what is the nature of reality? What is justice? What is the good life? And they came to the conclusion that our senses could deceive us and our reasoning could be flawed, so we could never truly know. So they decided to suspend judgment on such matters until they could gather more evidence or achieve a state of complete understanding. This was their skeptical method. It was their way of investigating philosophy. They would doubt everything that they couldn't prove beyond any doubt. And so they became the first skeptics. However, the Stoics, as the school developed, went on to provide answers to those questions despite acknowledging that human knowledge was limited. They created their own system of ethics and metaphysics and epistemology based on what they thought was right. So they moved away from skepticism and became dogmatically certain about some things. The skeptics remained as a school of philosophy for many centuries after the Stoics split off from them. However, they also didn't have a system of ethics per se. Instead, they advocated for suspending judgment on everything and not being dogmatic about anything. They were like scientists who say that there is no truth, only approximations of truth, and that we should always keep an open mind and be willing to change our opinions when faced with new evidence. Well, what does this all mean? What was their ethics? Was it just a matter of following your feelings? If you don't know the answer, well then don't worry, because you're not alone. We've been conditioned by society to trust our senses, but now more than ever before, we have reasons not to trust them. If you want to live a virtuous life, you must be aware of the limitations of your perception and use your reason to question everything. Be skeptical. That's why we started Modern Heathen. We have a podcast and an online academy where we teach ancient wisdom for modern skeptics. You can learn about Stoic philosophy, but also about cognitive biases and how to train your mind to overcome them and make better decisions. We have courses on ancient philosophy, on critical thinking, on mental health, and on much more. And we have a community of like-minded people who are just as curious as you are. Join us on our website. Use the link in the description below and get 10% off. Now let's go back to the history of skepticism. Ancient Greek skepticism was founded by Pyravelus in the 3rd century BC. He was inspired by the earlier skeptics who had preceded him, including some of the earlier Stoics, but he added some new ideas of his own. For example, he believed that we cannot even know whether or not we have a body, so we shouldn't make any assumptions about it. And he also believed that it is impossible for us to know anything with absolute certainty, so we should suspend judgment on everything. But unlike the earlier skeptics, Pyrrho did not see this as a problem. He argued that this is actually a good thing, because it leads to tranquility of mind. When we stop making judgments about things that we don't know, we become free from the passions and emotions that cause us pain. This is the main goal of skepticism, to attain a state of freedom from emotional disturbance and mental conflict. Pyrrho's teachings were then compiled by his student Sextus Empiricus in a series of 14 books called Outlines of Pyrrho, which gives us one of the most complete accounts of ancient skepticism. Now, Sextus divides these 14 books into 3 parts. The first 4 books are dedicated to cosmology and physics. The next 5 books are dedicated to logic, and the last 5 are dedicated to ethics. Now, in the first part, he tries to demonstrate that we cannot attain knowledge about the nature of reality. Then, in the second part, he argues that we cannot know anything for sure. And finally, in the third part, he shows that although we don't know anything for certain, we can still live a good life. How does he do that? Well, he says that we should follow our desires and avoid pain. Simple, right? Well, not so fast. He adds that we should do this without making any judgments about whether or not it is right or wrong. The problem with this ethical system is that it seems to imply that anything goes. If you can simply justify your actions by saying that you are following your desires or avoiding pain, then wouldn't that make any behavior acceptable? Well, not quite. You see, Sextus argued that we should follow only those desires that are natural to us, not those that are cultivated by society, and he believed that pain should be avoided whenever possible. But if we follow these 2 rules, wouldn't that just lead us to doing whatever we want without any moral qualms? Not necessarily. You see, Sextus also argued that we should consider the opinions of others when making decisions. If everyone around you thinks that something is wrong, then even if it's not really wrong, it's probably best to avoid doing it. Okay, so this is pretty much the basic idea behind ancient skepticism. Skeptics believe that we can't know anything for certain, so we should suspend judgment on everything. And they believe that the goal of philosophy is to attain a state of tranquility of mind. This is the main difference between Stoics and skeptics. Stoics believed that they could answer some questions about the world and about ethics, while skeptics rejected this idea. They believe that we can never really know anything for certain. Now, there are some similarities between the two. However, both Stoics and skeptics believed in the importance of self-control and both emphasized the need to avoid being judgmental. And what's interesting is that even though skeptics rejected the idea that we can know anything for certain, they still made claims about what we can and cannot know. So in a way, they were still dogmatic. They just thought that their skepticism was justified, because they had good reasons to think that those claims were true. Another similarity between Stoics and skeptics is that both of them can be used to justify inaction. Stoics like Epictetus argued that we should only take action when it is in accordance with nature, and skeptics like Sextus Empiricus argued that we should follow our natural desires. Both of these can be interpreted as a call to inaction. A Stoic might abstain from taking action because he believes that it is not in accordance with nature, or a skeptic might abstain from taking action because he doesn't want to upset the balance of nature. Despite these similarities, however, there is a clear distinction between Stoicism and skepticism. Stoics like Marcus Aurelius believe that we can rise above our desires and pursue what is good for us and for others, even if it is not in accordance with our natural desires. Skeptics, on the other hand, did not believe that we can do this. They thought that we are slaves to our desires, and that we should simply give in to them. Now, I personally am a fan of both Stoicism and skepticism. I think that they both have a lot to offer us today. Stoicism can help us to live a more virtuous life, while skepticism can help us to be more open-minded and to avoid making judgments about things that we do and know about. At the end of the day, however, we must decide for ourselves which philosophy we want to follow. There's no right or wrong answer here. It all depends on what we think is best. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel. Also check out our website for more great content. Thanks for watching, and remember to keep an open mind.